Ignition sequence start. 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. All engine running. Liftoff. We have a liftoff.
The Aerospace Corporation is an independent nonprofit corporation operating the only federally funded research and development center, or FFRDC, for the space enterprise. They perform objective technical analysis and assessment for a variety of government, civil, and commercial customers. My guest is Sam Wilson, a systems director for the Center for Space Policy and Strategy at the Aerospace Corporation. Sam is known for his work in defense space policy, national security, and space commerce. Sam, welcome to the broadcast.
Hey, thanks so much, Tom. Excited to be here.
Let's talk about, first of all, your background a little bit and how you became interested in space policy and commerce.
Yeah, absolutely. So I used to work on the congressional side at a congressional support agency called the Government Accountability Office. I was there for about 10 years. I was working on foreign policy defense issues. Mostly my work was on nuclear weapons and missile issues, and not a lot on space, although there was a natural overlap, right, between missile work and nuclear command and control work in space. And so I had I touched on space a bit with some of my work on the congressional side. And then with the Center for Space Policy and Strategy, about 6.5 years ago, was really starting up. And my boss, Jamie Moran, wanted to hire a nuclear analyst. So I took the position and then have since just been doing really national security space work. So it's been a really fun transition for me. I never thought I would work on space. I was never planning to work on space, but I've really fallen in love with the space policy issues.
It certainly is one of those fascinating fields that you don't know how deep it is until you just start getting into it, doesn't it?
Yeah, it's fun. I mean, I think it's also fun working on this right now, given how much is changing and how much of these core debates haven't happened in public. And so I think that there's one of the fun things to do. One of the fun things about working in this area is that you're able to do so much that hasn't been done before. And I think that's, there hasn't been as rich of, I would say, think tank academic work as you saw in like the nuclear world, for example. And part of this is just kind of the classification of space. But as that's been kind of changing in some respects, there's just been a lot more opportunity to write about this stuff. And that's the same time that I get to write about this stuff. So it's all worked out nicely.
So Sam, how does historical context inform our understanding of space security?
Great question. One of the things I think about, and one of the folks on my team who works part-time on our team is a historian, Aaron Bateman. And I was so excited that we were able to get him to come to aerospace, at least on a part-time basis, because having some of the historical understanding is so important for some of the debates now, because some of these same things were debated in the past, right? Like, I would say the way the Department of Defense is thinking about conflict in space mirrors some of the debates and issues that the department faced in the 70s with rising Soviet threats to U.S. space systems, coupled with the potential for the use of Soviet space systems for terrestrial attack on the United States or on terrestrial attacks on U.S. assets, such as maritime assets. So this kind of this weird situation where we want to try to protect spacecraft, and we have a lot of interest in protecting spacecraft, but we also are kind of concerned about how other countries are using spacecraft, is really similar today, right? And you kind of see that in some of the documents like the Space Force white paper on competitive endurance, which is kind of its strategy for how it thinks about conflict in space. You see this in the Department of Defense paper that they released in 2023 that was in response to Congress about how they think about conflict in space and space threats. And so there's, this again, you're trying to navigate, the department is trying to navigate this line between kind of worried about other countries' use of space, but also really worried about trying to protect its space assets. And those issues really haven't changed. And then more specifically, a lot of the same ideas that we're seeing today were used in the past. And even things like the Space Development Agency kind of has some roots and ties to the Strategic Defense Initiative in the 80s. So anyway, I think it's a really interesting area because we're seeing some of the same ideas being cycled through and some of the same issues is what the current policymakers are grappling with are similar to issues that prior policymakers grappled with.
Kind of along those lines, Sam, you've researched the reversal of the nuclear conventional entanglements in outer space by what was originally the U.S. Air Force, now presumably the Space Force. With that in mind, how do you see the separation of nuclear and non-nuclear spacecraft impacting all space activities?
It's a really interesting topic, right? I think it's hard to draw a really sharp split between spacecraft that are dedicated to nuclear command and control and spacecraft that are dedicated to kind of tactical conventional warfighting. And I think, when you saw my piece, it was a piece in the Journal of Strategic Studies about the reversal of nuclear conventional entanglement in space. It was specifically talking about strategic satellite communications. So there used to be for 40 years, we designed our nuclear command and control strategic communications spacecraft to serve both nuclear missions and conventional or tactical warfighting missions. And for this next generation, they're splitting those up into different spacecraft. So a certain set of spacecraft will be dedicated to the nuclear strategic mission, and then a separate set of spacecraft will be divided between the tactical and the conventional warfighting mission. That isn't to say that there is like this very clear divide between what is nuclear command and control satellites and not, right? Like, even a lot of the intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance systems are providing information that's feeding into nuclear command and control. So I think this is a thorny issue. It's an interesting issue given how much is changing with respect to U.S. approach to defense-based operations, as well as U.S. approach to nuclear command and control. But I wouldn't say that, I don't want to overstate and say that, this change is fully, it has happened or will be realized anytime soon, if it will ever be realized, right? Just given the kind of dual use nature of a lot of space systems.
So then what are the implications of disaggregation for commercial activities like satellite constellations and space-based services?
Yeah, the implications for disaggregation of commercial. So, I think you're seeing commercial providers, you're seeing a lot of commercial companies now providing some of the same services that you used to see reserved for only government missions. And I think that's interesting, and we'll see what that looks like in the future, right? Because I think there was, it may be that some of these commercial companies and commercial services will figure out what's profitable, what's not profitable, or what can they sell to the government or not. But I also just think this speaks again to the dual use nature of space systems, right? Like, right. You have communication satellites are valuable for civil purposes. They're valuable for commercial purposes. They're valuable for military purposes, right? You can use surveillance spacecraft for detecting an enemy military tarp in a forest, or you can use it to detect or to monitor the health of your crops if you're a farmer, right? Or to look at the health of the oceans and detect what the plankton levels are. So I mean, you can use these same types of spacecraft for multiple purposes. One of my favorite examples is missile warning, which you would think missile warning satellites are one of the clearest examples of this is purely a defense asset. This isn't a civilian asset or a commercial asset. But I live in California and we have a lot of forest fires. So a couple of years ago, our governor asked to use the missile warning satellites for detection of forest fires, right? So again, it's the same capability. In this case, the infrared sensors were valuable for a clearly civilian application, even though their main purpose is military.
And on the reverse side of that coin is the example of Elon Musk opening up Starlink for use by the Ukrainian military.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's been, I think, one of the big stories in national security space over the last few years has been with the influx of commercial activity and commercial services and kind of the spectrum of commercial capabilities in space. How should the U.S. government think about using those for defense purposes? And the Ukraine war, offered examples of kind of how valuable commercial systems were, and then some of the issues inherent in that, like how, if at all, should you protect these systems, and how, if at all, what is the level of control you want over these systems, and that those kinds of questions, I think the government's still grappling with, right? Like, and there's no easy answers to this, but clearly, the government is trying to move. The U.S. government is trying to move toward greater use of these commercial capabilities than existed in the past.
And I think one of the big questions that was raised by all that too was, does that make a commercial satellite a legitimate target for attack? And I think that was discussed in a lot of offices around the world.
Yeah, no, absolutely, absolutely. And even with whether it's a legitimate attack, whether it will be attacked, right? And we have kind of seen that. We've already seen some examples of commercial systems being attacked. And I mean, there's a lot of other, my former colleague, Robin Dickey, was on this podcast, and I'm sure she talked about some of her work that was looking at non-space examples where you had commercial actors being threatened in a conflict. So, all this stuff is, these are all like really deep, important issues. However, there are examples kind of outside of space that the government can think about when it's trying to decide what model and constructs it should use for this.
So in layman's terms, Sam, what's kind of the story on this year's space defense budget?
Yeah, thanks. And just as a small plug, so we had a paper out on Thursday about the defense space budget. This is the 4th annual budget brief that we've published. My predecessor published the first one, Russell Rumbaugh, and then he moved to run the Navy's budget, which he's been doing since, and then I've written the last 3. So the defense space budget this year is for the Space Force budget is $29.6 billion. Was in the request, which is about 3.5% of the Department of Defense's total budget request, and it's almost all of the defense DoD space spending is within the Space Force, although there is some money for there is some small dollar amounts kind of spread around other agencies and services on the DoD side, including things like the Army is still procuring some satellite communications, the Navy is procuring terminals. You have agencies like the Missile Defense Agency and DARPA with that are procuring that are doing some research and development on space. But most of this is in the Space Force. And over the last 5 years, one of the things that we've seen is the Space Force budget has grown nearly twofold from FY20 to FY 2025, from $15 billion to now requested at $29.6 billion. And a lot of that has been consolidation of defense-based activity from the other services, and then also just inherent growth. So this year was a bit unique in that it was the first year for the Space Force that this year's request is smaller than last year's request. So the Space Force we had seen was kind of been in this period of intense growth. And then this year, it's basically been pretty flat, at least considering adjusting for inflation from FY23, from fiscal year 2023 to now. So we'll see what the actual end up budget looks like. But at a top line, I think you've seen, now what we're seeing high levels of growth, and now you're seeing it relatively flat. Under that top line, I think one of the interesting stories of this year's budget was the push toward proliferation. So proliferation is this idea in space, of having more and more assets, right? And I think there's been this debate in the Department of Defense for a long time about how to best defend its space missions. And a dominant answer, I think you see in the budget, is proliferation, right? We're going to just rely on more systems, cheaper systems, and that's going to disincentivize an adversary, potential adversary, from trying to attack it. Because even if they attack a satellite and knock it out, we have so many more up there that are serving this mission, and that will lead to a more resilient architecture. So that to me, that was a big point of emphasis in this year's budget, and it's been a point of emphasis for a couple of years, but this year was really telling because you have this more constrained top line, and so even with fewer resources, the Department of Defense is still emphasizing proliferation.
My guest is Sam Wilson from the Aerospace Corporation on the Ex Terra Podcast. Take a moment right now to click subscribe to make sure you don't miss any of our podcasts or any of the other videos that you might be watching on YouTube from the Journal of Space Commerce. Sam, let's talk about a little bit how the commercial space factors into the Space Force budget. What's going on with the private companies and how they're interacting with this still relatively new branch of the military?
Yeah, great point. Great question. So, the acquisition, Department of Defense acquisition is largely developing custom capabilities for requirements that are established by the department, right? That's how it normally, this process normally happens. That there's a very specific requirements, and then they hire a contractor to develop a custom system to meet those requirements.
Right.
And now there's all these commercial space capabilities, and this ties into kind of the dual use nature of a lot of space services that exist. And some of these commercial space services capabilities are also trying to compete for some of these DoD contracts. And so that's been a really interesting change, is that the Department of Defense is trying to think about how can we buy this stuff that exists, and how does that affect our model, which is mostly based on building things and then having contractors, procure them at scale, right? Or procure maybe not at scale for space systems, but certainly some number of these systems. So that's been a challenge. There's been a lot of emphasis on this. You see one of the things you see in the Space Force budget is emphasis in the research and development on integrating commercial and national security systems. One of the things, as an example, is flexible terminals. That the Space Force budget is spending money on, which would create an opportunity, right, to use. Make it easier to use commercial systems and national security systems with spacecraft without having to procure specific terminals for each of the commercial capabilities that you're trying to use, right? Which is part of the challenge. So you're seeing some focus on integration. I think there are some people who are suggesting that we should still be spending a lot more on commercial space than we are, we as in Department of Defense. But I think I think the next couple of years will be really telling to see kind of where that goes. But this is a point of emphasis in comments from U.S. Space Force and DoD leadership, right? So it's something that I expect you'll see. You haven't seen it, I would say, in a large scale in the budget yet, but you are seeing some signs that this may come.
So then how can we reasonably balance national security concerns with fostering a vibrant space economy? And given all the fact that all of that money that's coming from national defense has to be appropriated by Congress, Congress can turn over every 2 years, the Senate every 6, the presidency every 4. I mean, that's a very, very fluid environment to try and make plans.
It is. I would also say that VC funding is pretty fluid too. So, I mean, there's like a level of risk that these companies are engaging in, regardless of where their funding is coming from, unless, there's huge private demand for their services, right. Such that they don't have to rely on either venture capital investment or U.S. government. And I would say outside of, commercial satellite communications, you don't have that yet, right? Like even, you have for electro-optical, which is, I think, more mature than some of the markets, you definitely have commercial interest, private interest, but not enough necessarily to be able to sustain those companies in the absence of government revenue. So, I think that's a challenge, right, for these companies is like, how do we get enough revenue? And so the government is like maybe an attractive customer in that regard. Even though, as you point out, there's a lot of challenges of doing that. There's also, more money available. So, I think, to me, I think it could be a win-win for the Department of Defense in that they could leverage commercial space capabilities to a greater extent. And that also provides some level of insurance, level of stable funding for some of the more promising commercial space companies, so that they can continue to exist. But it's challenging, right? Like there's trade-offs both ways.
But to that point, there does seem to be an increase in cooperation between the public and private sectors in space activities. How important is that for the long-term success in space, both for the government and for private companies?
I think it's integral, given that you're talking about a domain that, even though it's less expensive to put up satellites than it was before, and it's more achievable for a private company to do some of the things that only the government can do before. Right. It's still expensive, and you are and you can't put up. There's a number of how many assets you can put up there, right? And so you're dealing with, even though space is really big and we can accommodate a lot more spacecraft than we currently have, there has to be levels of cooperation between government and private sector and governments more generally about like how do we use these systems in a way that makes sense? How do we think about traffic, right, as space becomes more populated? So there's a lot of really tough questions that can't be solved by governments, especially now. Most of the spacecraft in orbit are owned by commercial companies, right? That's right. A big change from the past. So, I think you're going to need to have good levels of cooperation and collaboration between the U.S. Commercial sector and the U.S. government. I also just think, these lines are blurry, right? And they're always going to be blurry. And whenever I talk to people who say, okay, well, we should have just dedicated U.S. government systems or dedicated military systems, and then all the systems that are like helping civilian life. And I was like, okay, well, that sounds good. What about GPS? GPS is owned by the Department of Defense, right? So do we want to say that we don't want to use GPS for civilian daily life, right? Like that would make my life a lot harder.
We'd all be lost, quite literally.
Yeah, I don't know how I get to the office today. I don't know what the fastest way to get to the office. It probably would have taken me 5 more minutes. So this is, this is something that I don't think people would think is like a reasonable idea. But you hear some of these, these ideas thrown out of like, yeah, we should make these sharp divisions without kind of thinking through how civilian life is really needs some of these DoD defense satellite systems.
Well, but to that point as well is that things like, okay, GPS, it's owned by the Department of Defense, but as taxpayers, we paid for that. Shouldn't we be entitled to be able to use that at least? And okay, maybe not the millimeter resolution that they always talked about, dumbing it down back in the early days of GPS, so you couldn't get like real specific with it. But I would think as a taxpayer, that's something that I should be allowed to use because I help pay for it.
Yeah. No, I mean, I'm not my view is that the nexus, the dual use nature of these systems means that we benefit from it, we civilians benefit from it, and the Department of Defense benefits from it. I mean, I also think that you can make an argument that we also benefit from the Department of Defense having capabilities that we're not accessing, right?
Oh, sure.
It's for but still, but yeah, no, I think it's a good thing, right? Like, I mean, I think clearly it's the option, the alternative of us not using GPS is pretty unattractive. So which is just why I think these statements about kind of drawing these sharp lines, I don't think make a lot of sense.
So the Rand McNally people might be for it, and the AAA might have us trying all to go back to our triptychs, but you may not even know what that is. Sam, are there really any specific commercial space ventures that are exciting you, given some of the recent developments that have been going on in the industry?
Yeah, I think one of the areas that doesn't get as much attention that I think will be really interesting is some of the ground capabilities, like in commercial ground stations as a service. This doesn't get as enough attention. It doesn't get a ton of attention because people are really interested in thinking about satellites. But that's going to be really important, right? And more important as we move to these large constellations, is thinking about how can we get the data as quickly as possible? How can we get it processed as quickly as possible? And you're seeing even some of these ground stations. These were some of the threat vectors for some of the attacks that happened on commercial systems in the Ukraine war. So I think as you move toward these more proliferated constellations of satellites for the Department of Defense, you're going to see potential adversaries thinking less about attacking an individual satellite and thinking about how do we attack networks of satellites, and that kind of points you to ground systems. So some of the commercial ground ventures are, I think, particularly interesting to me.
We've just got a little bit more time, but I have a couple of more things I want to talk with you about. And first of all, maybe some policy changes. Are there policy changes that you would recommend to enhance both the space security and space commerce opportunities?
Yeah, I think, this is going back to the idea we talked about a little bit, but thinking about how the Department of Defense can help, can take advantage and leverage commercial capability to a greater extent, while also benefiting those commercial companies because they have a stable source of income. I just think this is so important, right? I just think, a lot of the commercial space capabilities companies that came into that we've seen kind of mature are companies that got venture capital funding in this period where there was a lot of U.S. government push to kind of create more money, and that has now declined. And so, with inflation going up, and you're seeing kind of our U.S. macro policy changing, that means that there's going to be less venture private funding that's going into these things. And so that's going to mean, but you have all this like really cool capability that exists. So how do we kind of, the U.S. government really needs to think about how can we take advantage of these capabilities, and also for the really promising ones, how can we help them survive, right? Like how can we help them bridge that gap? And I mean, a great parallel is thinking about the early aviation industry, right? Airlines weren't profitable in the beginning, and it was too expensive for individuals to ride on airplanes. And, a lot of those companies made it survive because of contracts with the U.S. government, right? Big contracts with the U.S. government. So that's something, and who knows if some of these commercial space capabilities will ever be as profitable as airlines. But I do think it's worth it for the government to try to make some of those bets.
It was also helpful that you didn't have to throw the airplane away every time it flew and build a new one.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
Sam, we're just about out of time here, but we do ask this last question of all of our guests, and that's to look out, if you might, over the next 10 to 15 years in space commerce and the role that you might play in it, or your organization might play in it, and tell me what you see.
Well, I think the center is doing really important work trying to refine and advance some of the public debates around space. And so, I think one of our comparative advantages is having kind of the technical breadth and depth of aerospace, being able to try to leverage that and tie that into policy insights. So I see us continuing to, as technology changes, as the policy environment continues to evolve around some of these issues, think about how do we bridge the gap between some of these technical insights and some of the policy questions, and get to solutions that I think and framings that I think will benefit policymakers.
Sam, we're out of time, but I want to tell you I really appreciate you joining me today. It's been a really interesting conversation, so thanks so much.
Hey, Tom, thanks for having me.
Sam Wilson is a systems director for the Center for Space Policy and Strategy at the Aerospace Corporation. And that's going to do it for this edition of the Ex Terra Podcast. You can subscribe to the audio version of the podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Audible, and many other popular podcasting platforms. Be sure to click subscribe so you don't miss any of our podcasts or any of our other videos. You can get daily updates on space commerce by subscribing to the Journal of Space Commerce on Substack at www.xterrajsc.com. And one thing more, be sure to connect with us on LinkedIn and follow us on X at XTerraJSC. Until next time, I'm Tom Patton. Thanks for joining us.
I want to go faster, faster. Hands in the air, we're going to crash. Searching for the answers. My Galileo, the proof is looking glass. Thirst for reason. A dreamer's eyes we gaze into a sense of purpose, know my view. Like finding water on the moon.